Module 9, Equity, Blended Finance, and Leverage. Picture a solar mini-grid company that wants to electrify 20 villages in a remote province of your country. It has a good plan, but when it goes looking for money, it hits a wall. The local bank will only lend a small amount and only at a punishing interest rate because the bank has never seen a rural solar business survive long enough to pay back a loan. So the company is stuck. It has a project the world says it wants and no money to build it. This module is about the tools we use to break exactly that kind of deadlock. By the end of this module, you'll understand 3 things: what equity actually is in plain terms and how it differs from a loan, how blended finance uses public money to pull in private money, including the idea of first loss capital, and why the leverage ratio that everyone loves to quote can be both useful and quietly misleading. Let's start with equity, because if you're near zero on finance, this is the one term that trips people up the most. In the last few modules, we talked a lot about loans. A loan is debt. Someone gives you money, and you owe it back, usually with interest on a schedule, whether your project succeeds or not. Equity is the other great category of finance, and it works on a completely different logic. When someone puts equity into a project, they are not lending you money. They are buying a piece of ownership. They become a part owner of the business. Here's the everyday analogy. Think of buying a house. Suppose the house costs $100,000. You put $20,000 of your own savings in, and you borrow $80,000 from the bank. Your $20,000 is the equity. The bank's $80,000 is the debt. Now, if the house rises in value, the gain is yours, the owner's. If the house loses value, your $20,000 takes the hit first, before the bank loses a cent. That is the essence of equity. It owns the upside, and it absorbs the losses first. So equity has 2 defining features, and I want you to hold on to both. The first is that equity gets paid last. If the project makes money, the lenders get paid their interest first, and whatever is left over belongs to the equity owners. If the project loses money, the equity owners lose first, and only if things get truly bad do the lenders start to lose. Equity sits at the bottom of the pile. Financiers call this being junior, and we'll come back to that word. The second feature follows from the first. Because equity takes more risk, it expects a higher reward. A lender might be happy with, say, 6 or 8% interest, because a lender is relatively protected. An equity investor is exposed to everything going wrong, so an equity investor wants the chance of a much bigger return, maybe 15 or 20% or more, to make that risk worth taking. This is just the risk and return idea from Module 2 showing up in a new costume. The more risk you carry, the more return you demand. If equity is so risky, why would any project want it instead of just borrowing? Isn't a loan cheaper? A loan is cheaper, yes, but a loan is also rigid and dangerous. Debt has to be repaid on a fixed schedule no matter what. If your solar company hits a bad year, the loan payment still comes due, and if you can't make it, you can go bankrupt. Equity is patient. It doesn't demand a payment every quarter. It rides along with the business, taking less in the bad years and more in the good ones. And crucially, a young or risky project often can't get much debt at all because lenders are too nervous. It needs someone willing to own the risk. That's equity's job. In practice, a real project uses both. Some equity as the foundation and some debt stacked on top. That combination is what we called the capital stack back in Module 3. Now, why does any of this matter for climate finance in a developing country? Because the projects we care about, clean energy, resilient infrastructure, sustainable agriculture, are often too new, too small, or seen as too risky to attract private equity or private lenders on their own. The perceived risk is just too high, so the money doesn't flow. And this is the wall our solar company hit at the start. This brings us to the central idea of the module, blended finance. Blended finance is the deliberate use of public or philanthropic money from a donor, an MDB, or a climate fund, to change the risk and return picture of a project so that private investors are willing to come in alongside. Let me give you the plainest definition I can. Blended finance is using a smaller amount of patient, risk-tolerant public money to unlock a larger amount of cautious private money that would otherwise have stayed on the sidelines. The key word is alongside. Blended finance is not the public sector paying for the whole project. It's the public sector taking a specific slice of the risk so that private capital feels safe enough to take the rest. Think of it like a parent co-signing a young person's first apartment lease. The parent doesn't pay the rent. The parent just stands behind part of the risk, and that's enough to make the landlord say yes. So how, concretely, does public money change the risk picture? There are a few mechanisms, and I'll give you the most important one, because it's the heart of blended finance. It's called first loss capital, and it goes hand in hand with the idea of junior and senior positions. Remember I said equity gets paid last and absorbs losses first. Blended finance takes that idea and uses it as a tool. Imagine a fund that will invest in 20 clean energy projects across the region. The fund raises its money in layers. At the bottom sits a layer of public money from a donor or a climate fund, and this layer agrees to absorb the first losses if any projects fail. On top of it sits the private investor's money, which will only take a loss if the losses are so big that they blow right through the public layer underneath. That bottom layer is called the first loss, or junior, tranche. The word tranche is just French for slice, and in finance it means one layer of a deal with its own level of risk. The private money on top is the senior tranche, senior because it gets paid first and loses last. Let me make the numbers concrete, and I'll say them the way you'd hear them. Suppose the fund is $100 million. A donor puts in $20 million as first loss capital. Private investors put in the other $80 million as senior capital. Now, if some projects fail and the fund loses, say, $15 million, who eats that loss? The donor's $20 million cushion absorbs all of it. The private investors lose nothing. Their $80 million is protected unless total losses climb above $20 million. From the private investor's point of view, the world just got a lot safer. Their downside is cushioned, and so they're willing to invest where they never would have before. That $20 million of public money didn't just fund one project. It made $80 million of private money feel comfortable enough to show up. That is crowding in, the phrase you'll hear constantly. Public money crowds in private money. Isn't this just a subsidy for rich investors? The donor takes the losses and the private guys keep the profits. Why is that a good use of scarce public money? That's exactly the right challenge, and it's the honest tension at the center of blended finance. The defense is this: the public money isn't there to make private investors rich. It's there to get a project built that otherwise wouldn't exist at all, so that a village gets electricity or a coastline gets protected. If $20 million of donor money causes $80 million of private investment and 20 electrified villages, and if over time those projects prove that clean energy in rural areas can actually work, then the next fund might need less public support and eventually none. The public money is meant to be a temporary bridge that retires itself. The criticism, which you should take seriously, is that too often it isn't temporary. The private returns are generous, and the public sector is quietly absorbing risk that the market should have grown up to carry by now. Both things are true, and a good practitioner watches for which one is happening in front of them. Now, the first loss tranche is the marquee tool, but blended finance has a wider toolkit, and you already met some of it. A guarantee, which we covered in Module 8, is a form of blended finance. Public money standing behind a private loan. A concessional loan sitting inside a project's capital stack alongside a commercial loan is blended finance. Technical assistance grants that pay for the feasibility studies and the legal work, so the private investor doesn't have to. That's blended finance too. The common thread is always the same: public money doing something specific so that private money will follow. Let me give you one more mechanism, because it's subtle and you'll see it. The concessional layer that improves the return rather than just cushioning the loss. Sometimes the problem isn't that private investors fear losing money. It's simply that the project's return is a bit too low to be worth their while. In that case, public money can go in as equity or a loan that deliberately accepts a lower return than it could get, taking, say, 2% when the market would want 10%, which lifts the return available to the private money sitting alongside it. It's the same idea as first loss, seen from a different angle. The public money accepts a worse deal, so the private money gets a good enough one to say yes. Whether the tool is absorbing losses or accepting a thin return, the logic never changes. Public money gives something up so that private money will show up. One thing to keep straight, because people muddle it. Blended finance and de-risking are close cousins but not identical. De-risking, from the earlier modules, is anything that lowers the risk a private investor faces, a guarantee, insurance, a first loss cushion. Blended finance is the broader practice of combining public and private money on different terms in one structure, of which de-risking is the most common purpose. In a real deal, you'll often hear both words used for the same arrangement, and that's fine. Just remember that the goal underneath all of it is to make a project that private money wouldn't touch into one it will. Let me ground this in the institutions you work with. The IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, does blended finance constantly. So does ADB and the bilateral DFIs like Germany's KfW, France's Proparco, and the British International Investment. The Green Climate Fund is explicitly mandated to crowd in private capital, and a chunk of its money goes into exactly these blended structures. So when you sit in a room with these institutions, and someone says, we can bring a concessional first loss tranche to make this bankable, you now know precisely what they mean. They mean, we'll put public money at the bottom of the stack to absorb the first losses, so private money will sit on top. Which brings us to the last big idea of the module, and the one where I want you to keep your guard up: leverage and the leverage ratio. Leverage, in this context, simply means how much private money each dollar of public money pulls in. If a donor puts in 20 million and it crowds in 80 million of private capital, people will say the leverage ratio is 4-to-1. $4 of private money for every $1 of public money. And the whole billions to trillions story from Module 3, the idea that public funds must be used to unlock far larger private investment, lives or dies on leverage. High leverage is the dream. A little public money, a lot of private money, the gap closed. Here's why you should be careful. The leverage ratio is one of the most abused numbers in climate finance, and as a practitioner you'll see it waved around in ways that don't hold up. There are 3 traps. The first trap is counting. If a project has public money and private money in it, how much of the private money did the public money actually cause? Some of it might have shown up anyway. If a bank was always going to lend to a wind farm and a donor grant gets added on top, it's not honest to claim the grant leveraged the whole loan. The genuine question is additionality, a word from Module 2, meaning, what happened because of the public money that would not have happened without it? Leverage ratios routinely take credit for private money that wasn't truly mobilized. The second trap is that the highest leverage ratios tend to show up exactly where they're least needed. It's easy to get 4-to-1 or 10-to-1 leverage on a big solar plant in a middle-income country that private investors already like. It's brutally hard to get any leverage at all on a small adaptation project, like a flood warning system or a mangrove restoration scheme, because there's no revenue stream for private money to chase. So if institutions are rewarded for high leverage numbers, they drift toward the easy, mitigation-heavy, middle-income deals and away from the poorest countries and the adaptation projects that need help most. The leverage metric can quietly pull money in the wrong direction. Hold on to that, because it comes back hard in Module 11. The third trap is that leverage is a means, not an end. Nobody's coastline is protected by a leverage ratio. The point was never to maximize a number. It was to get real projects built that cut emissions or reduce vulnerability. A modest deal with 2-to-1 leverage that builds real resilience for poor people is worth more than a flashy 10-to-1 deal that would have happened anyway. As a practitioner, when someone leads with the leverage ratio, your job is to ask the quieter questions. What got built, for whom, and would it have happened without the public money? So, to bring it together, equity is ownership, not debt. It gets paid last and loses first, and because it carries the most risk, it demands the highest return. Blended finance uses public money to change the risk and return picture so that private money will invest alongside it, and its signature tool is first loss capital, a junior tranche of public money that absorbs losses first and lets a larger senior tranche of private money feel safe enough to show up. That's what crowding in means. And leverage, the ratio of private money to public money, is the headline metric of the whole billions to trillions agenda, but it's easily gamed. It drifts toward the deals that need help least, and it's a means, not the goal. Keep asking what actually got built. In the next module, we turn to two more instruments with a very different flavor: paying for results only after they're delivered and using a country's debt itself as a lever for climate action.